Silence reigned on Fifth Avenue, worth more than any gold. In this silence there was no sound of crystal clinking, no rustle of Balenciaga silk dresses, no laughter of social lionesses. The apartment's owner, 59-year-old Ann Woodward, lay dead. On the bedside table next to her lay not a pistol, not a knife, and not a farewell note written on letterhead paper. There lay a fresh issue of Esquire magazine. The glossy cover gleamed in the lamplight like a guillotine blade. The killer of this woman was not a person, but text. Several thousand words, printed in ink on paper, destroyed her faster and more reliably than any poison. Although it was poison that put the final period in this story. Anne took potassium cyanide. Death was agonizing but quick. It was a pill that, according to rumors, she had kept for many years, like a talisman for the darkest day. And that day came not when she lost her husband, and not when all of New York turned away from her. It came when her most terrible secret became entertainment for millions of readers. Today we watch Ryan Murphy's series where Hollywood stars like Demi Moore try on the diamonds and tragedies of that era. We call it Feud. We discuss costumes and interiors, sitting on the couch with a phone in hand. But for Ann Woodward, it wasn't a script. It was agony stretched over 2 decades. She was the very woman who, everyone believed, committed the perfect crime. A social climber, a former nightclub dancer who ensnared the heir to one of America's richest banking empires, and then blew half his head off with a hunting shotgun. Think about the numbers. The Woodward family fortune in the mid-20th century was estimated at $100 million. Adjusted for today's rate, that's more than $1.1 billion. These were the kind of money that could buy everything. The best seats at the opera, champion horses, mansions in France, and the silence of the police. But this money couldn't buy Ann Woodward a life. Her story is not just a crime chronicle. It's a lesson in the anatomy of high society. It's a tale of how the elite devours its own children. For the tragedy didn't end with Anne. The curse unleashed by that shot struck her sons. Both boys, James and William III, heirs to the empire, later took their own lives by jumping out of windows. The lineage ended. The vast fortune dissolved. But let's return to that October night in 1955, which became the beginning of the end. Imagine an estate on Long Island, Oyster Bay, a place where not just rich people live, but those whose names are carved on the facades of libraries and hospitals. That night, in the bedroom of the house known as the Playhouse, a shot rang out. A 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun. A roar that should have awakened conscience, but instead awakened only lawyers. Ann Woodward claimed she mistook her husband for a burglar. At that time, a vagrant was indeed being caught in the area, and this coincidence became her lifeline. Legally, she was clean. The grand jury refused to bring charges. Her mother-in-law, the great Elsie Woodward, paid a fortune to hush up the matter. Not for her daughter-in-law, whom she despised, but for the family honor. But the lynch mob, orchestrated by high society New York, turned out to be scarier than the electric chair. And so, 20 years later, Truman Capote, a small man with a sharp tongue and phenomenal memory, decided to sell this story. He was the court jester admitted to the boudoirs of Manhattan's queens. He listened, remembered, nodded, poured champagne, and then spilled all their secrets onto the pages of the magazine. In his story, the character based on Anne kills her husband, coldly, calculatingly, simply because he wanted a divorce. Capote tore off her mask of the grieving widow and put on her the mask of a monster. When Anne saw the galleys of this text, she understood. This is the end. They wouldn't forgive her a second time. She called friends, said goodbye, but no one realized it was a farewell forever. She drank the poison so as not to hear the whispers behind her back. The paradox of this story is that Anne Woodward spent her whole life running from poverty. She was born in Kansas, in dust and obscurity, and devoted her life to climbing to the shining top of the pyramid. She lied, intrigued, seduced, and endured humiliations to become Mrs. Woodward. And when she reached the peak, when she owned millions, when her jewel boxes held emeralds worth a small country, she found herself in total isolation. In an empty apartment, alone with a magazine that cost just $1, but took everything from her. How did it happen? How did a girl from a simple family manage to make New York's most eligible bachelor fall in love with her? How did she become the mistress of an estate where dinner was served by liveried footmen? And why did this marriage, which began like a Cinderella fairy tale, end with blood on the carpet and cyanide in a glass? To understand this, we need to rewind the tape back. Not to the moment of the shot, and not even to the wedding. We need to go back to the origins, to where the first coins of this bloody empire were forged, to the man who created the Woodward's wealth without even suspecting that one day it would kill all his descendants. William Woodward Sr., known as the banker, built his world for eternity. He thought that concrete and gold would protect his family from any storms. He was wrong. The foundation he laid turned out to be rotten. And now we will descend into the basement of this story to see what this magnificent, shining, and deadly dangerous house really stood on. Great fortunes never smell of Chanel perfume. At the very beginning, they always smell of printing ink, cheap tobacco, nervous sweat, and the fear of competitors. To understand the tragedy of Anne and Billy Woodwards, we need to forget about the balls of the 1950s and go back half a century, to the era when the dollar was as solid as granite, and the people who owned those dollars were made of steel. The Woodward Empire did not arise out of thin air. It was forged in the gloomy offices of Wall Street, where sunlight rarely penetrated through the thick cigarette smoke. The foundation of this wealth was the Hanover National Bank. It was not just a financial institution, but a fortress. At the end of the 19th century, when America was boiling, building railroads and extracting oil, this bank was the very pump that pumped the blood of the economy into the pockets of the elite. The dynasty's founders were not social lions. James Woodward, uncle of the future patriarch, and his brother, William, started as men of numbers, not emotions. This was the archetype of the Commodore. Tough, stern men who believed that rest was a sin and luxury should be heavy and functional. They survived the banking panic of 1907 not just without losses, but with colossal profit. While other bankers were jumping out of windows or selling family silver, the Woodwards were buying assets for pennies. It is in such moments of crisis that true superfortunes are born. They bought the fear of other people and converted it into their own power. William Woodward Sr., father of our future murdered hero, inherited this gigantic mechanism and turned it into something more. He became chairman of the bank in 1910. Imagine this man, tall, prim, with impeccable posture and a gaze that could freeze an interlocutor from a distance. He did not chase fashion. He himself was the standard. His life was subordinated to a strict regimen: morning review of quotations, meetings with the board of directors, evening gentlemen's club. In his world, money was a tool of domination, not a means of entertainment. He lived in a mansion on 9th East Street, House 9, which resembled a museum rather than a home. Heavy oak panels, velvet curtains absorbing any sound, and silence. In this house, one could not run, laugh loudly, or show weakness. But this stern ledger had one bright, passionate chapter: horses. If Woodward Sr. truly loved anyone, it was not people, but thoroughbred stallions. He owned the legendary Bel Air Stud Farm in Maryland. This estate was the oldest in America, land steeped in history from colonial times. For Woodward, horse racing was not just a hobby, but the sport of kings. And he wanted to be a king. It was here that the only crack in his armor of asceticism appeared. No money was spared on horses. The Bel Air stables were cleaner and more luxurious than the homes of most Americans of that time. Woodward Sr. bred 2 Triple Crown winners, Gallant Fox in 1930 and Omaha in 1935. This was an unprecedented achievement. When Gallant Fox won, the prize money for one season alone amounted to more than $300,000. In modern terms, that's about $5.5 million. And that's just the prize money, not counting the value of the stallion himself as a sire. In this atmosphere of paradox, his son, Billy Woodward, grew up. On one hand, the cult of hard work and responsibility to the family name. The father instilled in him that he was not just a man, but the guardian of the sacred fire of the Hanover Bank. On the other hand, the insane luxury of racetracks, where champagne flowed like a river, and victory was measured in fractions of a second. Billy saw how his father, the stern banker, turned into a gambler when his horses lined up at the start. William Sr. was convinced that he had built an eternal empire. He believed that his bank would stand for 1,000 years, and his descendants would rule New York from their redwood-paneled offices. But he made a fatal mistake. He taught his son to spend and take pride in status, but failed to pass on that inner core that allowed survival in the jungles of business. He created a golden cage for his son, protected from reality by the thick walls of the bank and the high fences of the estate. Woodward Sr. did not know that, while accumulating millions, he was also accumulating future problems. Every dollar earned by his tough decisions, every bankruptcy he turned to his advantage, became a brick in the wall of karma that one day would collapse on his son's head. The old banker died in 1953, leaving Billy not just a fortune, but colossal responsibility and freedom to which he was not ready. The empire was built. The walls were high, the vaults full. But inside this castle, a draft had already begun to blow. Billy Woodward received the keys to the kingdom, not understanding that along with the gold, he had inherited a target on his back. And somewhere in Kansas, in a completely different world, a girl was already growing up who one day would want her share of this kingdom, no matter the cost. If William Woodward Sr. was the architect who laid the foundation of granite and bank bills, then his heirs became those who decided to adorn this granite with gilding, velvet, and deadly sins. We are entering an era when America, having won World War II, was basking in money. It was a time when it seemed the party would never end. And at the center of this endless celebration, on the highest throne, sat William "Billy" Woodward Jr. Billy was the perfect product of his environment. He was the only son, the golden boy, on whom the whole family preyed. From childhood, his feet did not touch New York's dirty sidewalks. He traveled from limousine to private train car, from first-class cabin to racetrack box. He received education at Groton School and Harvard, the standard route for American aristocracy, where knowledge was secondary compared to useful connections. During the war, he served as a lieutenant in the Navy, and even a torpedo that hit his ship off the shores of Okinawa could not kill him. He returned a hero, handsome, tall, fabulously rich, and completely unadapted to real life without a retinue of servants. But he was not the king of this world. True power belonged to his mother, Elsie Woodward. This woman was called the last Grand Dame of New York. Elsie was not just a rich widow. She was an institution. She lived in apartments at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and her approval could open any doors, while her raised eyebrow could destroy a reputation forever. Elsie belonged to that breed of people who believed that emotions were the lot of maids. She controlled the trust funds, family councils, and, most importantly, she controlled Billy. In this stuffy atmosphere, saturated with the smell of old money and mothballs, Billy sought an escape. He was bored being just the banker's son. He wanted life, pulse, risk. And he found it all, not in stock quotes, but in nightclubs where a new phenomenon was emerging: cafe society. It was a motley mix of aristocrats, Hollywood stars, and adventurers. It was there, in the smoke of the Fee-Fi Monte Carlo Club, that he met her. Anne Eden. Real name, Angeline Lucille Crowell. A girl from Kansas who arrived in New York with one suitcase and ambitions exceeding the gold reserves of Fort Knox. She was not an aristocrat. She was a radio actress, model, dancer. In Elsie Woodward's terminology, she was nobody. But for Billy, she became a breath of fresh, albeit vulgar, air. Anne was predatory, bright, sexy, and utterly fearless. She saw in Billy not just a man, but a key to the world she read about in society columns. Their romance unfolded against backdrops whose cost today seems fantastic. Imagine the scale of spending. The young couple didn't just live, they consumed the world. Their wedding in 1943 at St. Luke's Lutheran Church became a slap in the face to the old guard. Elsie Woodward boycotted the engagement, but was forced to accept the marriage to avoid scandal. She looked at her daughter-in-law like an exotic animal that had accidentally wandered into the living room. After the war, a real arms race in luxury began. The Woodwards moved between residences like monarchs. Winter in Palm Beach, spring in Paris, summer in Newport, fall on the Hunt. Anne's wardrobe alone cost tens of thousands of dollars a year. She ordered dresses from high-fashion masters, understanding that clothing was her armor. In this circle, one could not appear in the same outfit twice. If you repeated yourself, it meant your husband had liquidity problems. This was the Gilded Age 2.0. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Snow-white yachts moored off the Côte d'Azur, parties where caviar was served by the kilogram, and Cristal champagne flowed like a river. Billy became even more obsessed with horse racing than his father. He spent millions buying the best stallions. His pride was Nashua, the legendary horse that would become the symbol of their wealth and their curse. Maintaining the stable cost an amount that could run a small hospital. But behind the facade of marble and smiles for town and country magazine photographers, rot was beginning to show. Money obtained without effort has a way of corrupting the soul. Billy did not know how to earn. He only knew how to spend. He felt he did not measure up to the bar set by his father. He was merely the husband of that flashy blonde and the son of that great banker. This bred complexes, and complexes in this circle were treated in two ways: alcohol and affairs. Anne, in turn, discovered that the golden cage was locked from the inside. She had received everything: jewels, the title of Mrs. Woodward, access to the best homes. But she never received the main thing: respect. For Elsie's friends, she remained that dancer. Every step she took, every gesture was scrutinized under a microscope. She tried to be perfect. She studied French, took etiquette lessons, hired the best decorators. But the more she tried, the colder the gazes around her became. She began to understand that this marriage was not a triumph, but a constant war. A war with her mother-in-law, a war with public opinion, and finally, a war with Billy himself. The young heir began to tire of his trophy wife. His gaze fell more and more often on other women, younger, calmer, more pedigreed. Anne sensed the threat with her skin. She understood. If Billy divorced her, she would lose everything. She had no money of her own, no profession, no protection. She would return to the dirt from which she had crawled, and this fear turned her life into paranoia. By the mid-1950s, their marriage resembled a beautiful apple riddled with worms inside. In public, they were America's golden couple, beautiful, tanned, laughing. But behind the closed doors of mansions, shouts were heard, dishes were smashed, and gin was poured. Billy was becoming more aggressive, Anne more hysterical. They were trapped in the labyrinth of their own ambitions and expectations. They were so rich they could buy justice, but they could not buy happiness. Their wealth isolated them from reality, creating a vacuum in which any sound was amplified tenfold. And in this vacuum, a storm was already beginning to form. The social war that Anne was waging for her place in the sun was about to escalate to a hot phase. She did not yet know that her main enemy would not be the gossip behind her back, but her own fears. This was the first generation that did not build, but consumed. They thought resources were infinite. They thought the rules were written for others. They were wrong. History was preparing to present them with the bill, and the amount on that check would be written in blood. We are approaching the moment when Anne Woodward's social ascent will collide with the impenetrable wall of old money and contempt, and the blow will be devastating. Mid-20th century New York was a battlefield where blood was not spilled on asphalt, but on Persian rugs. It was a war without shots, but with a colossal number of victims. A war between old money and new money. And Anne Woodward found herself on the front lines, armed only with her beauty, ambitions, and her husband's checkbook. The enemy was formidable. The old guard of New York, the so-called Knickerbockers, traced their lineage back to Dutch settlers. For them, money was as natural as air. Talking about it was vulgar, flaunting it, unforgivable. Elsie Woodward, Billy's mother, was the general of this army. She did not shout or make scenes. It was enough for her simply not to notice a person to destroy their social status. In her world, there was an unwritten code of laws, as rigid as a prison statute. You must be born on the right street, baptized in the right church, and marry your friend's cousin from the country club. Anne violated all these rules by the mere fact of her existence. She was an upstart. In the eyes of Elsie and her circle, Anne forever remained that girl from the radio who climbed to the top through the bed. When Anne entered a ballroom, conversations hushed for a second, then resumed with double the intensity, but in whispers. Lorgnettes were raised to appraise her dress, not to admire, but to find a flaw. Too bright a color? Too deep a neckline? Too loud a laugh? Everything Anne did was interpreted as proof of her lowly origins. Anne understood that she would never be accepted by right of birth. Therefore, she decided to storm this fortress. Her strategy was aggressive luxury. If they did not respect her name, let them envy her diamonds. She turned her body and wardrobe into weapons of mass destruction. Anne became an icon of style, but a screaming Hollywood style. She wore furs when others wore tweed. She put on rubies the size of pigeon eggs for breakfast. She wanted to be noticeable enough that it was impossible to ignore her. But the main arena of this war became real estate. The Woodwards owned an estate in Oyster Bay, but living under the same roof with Elsie was unbearable. The mother-in-law controlled every step, from the dinner menu to the choice of flowers for the garden. Anne was suffocating. She needed her own kingdom. Thus, the Playhouse renovation project appeared. Initially, it was just an entertainment pavilion on the estate grounds, but Anne turned it into a full-fledged palace. This was an act of separatism. She was building her own court, where Elsie had no entry. In this social war, Anne needed heavy artillery, allies whose status was higher than that of the local snobs. And she found them. It was a brilliant and cynical move. Anne began hunting dukes and counts, but her main trophy was Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, the woman for whom the King of England abdicated the throne. Wallis herself was American, herself an outcast in the royal family, and she adored rich people ready to pay for her whims. Anne Woodward did everything to befriend the Windsors. She threw parties in their honor, on which tens of thousands of dollars were spent. She knew, if the former King of England sat at her table, no New York prude would dare refuse an invitation. This was buying legitimacy for cash. Friendship with the Duchess became Anne's shield. When she walked arm in arm with Wallis, even Elsie Woodward was forced to grit her teeth and smile. But this victory came at a high price. Billy Woodward found himself between two fires. On one side, the domineering mother who kept her hand on the pulse of the family trust and constantly dripped into his brain that he had married a vulgar gold digger. On the other side, the wife who demanded constant confirmation of her status, had hysterics over a maid's sidelong glance, and spent his inheritance at a frightening speed. Billy was the weak link in this chain. He could not protect his wife from his mother, nor protect his mother from his wife. He chose a third path: escape. Escape into alcohol and other women. And this became the most terrible blow for Anne. Her social position rested solely on the status of Mrs. William Woodward, Jr. Without a husband, she was nobody. Divorce meant not just loss of money, it meant social death, exile, return to oblivion. By 1955, the tension reached its limit. Anne felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Rumors of Billy's infidelity became too loud to ignore. They whispered that he wanted a divorce, that Elsie had already found him a suitable match. For Anne, this sounded like a death sentence. She had invested 10 years of her life to climb this mountain. She endured humiliations, she molded herself into a lady, she bore heirs. And now they wanted to throw her out like a used napkin. The war entered its final phase. It was no longer a struggle for ball invitations, it was a struggle for survival. Anne became a paranoid. She saw enemies everywhere. She thought the servants were spying for her mother-in-law, that friends laughed at her as soon as the door closed. Pills appeared in her purse, sedatives, sleeping pills, amphetamines to stay alert, a cocktail of chemicals and despair. It was in this state, at the peak of nervous exhaustion and fear of losing everything, that she approached that fatal line. The social ladder she had been climbing turned out to be a ladder to the scaffold. She won the battle for the Duchess of Windsor's attention. After all, that last dinner on October 30th was held in the Duchess's honor. But she lost the war for her husband's soul. Anne Woodward stood in the center of the ballroom, shining with diamonds. But inside,
she was cornered. And a cornered beast, as is known, is capable of anything. Even if that beast wears a Chanel dress and drinks vintage champagne. The social war ended. Criminal Chronicle began. But before the shot rings out, we need to understand one more detail of this era's mechanism: how exactly titles were bought and sold, and why the Woodwards' marriage was doomed to become part of this cynical trade.
In the world of big capital, there is one commodity that cannot be produced in a factory or extracted from an oil well. It's legitimacy. It's the centuries-old dust on the family crest, the ability to wear a tiara as if it were a knitted cap, and the blood that, by common belief, must be blue. For the American elite, grown on money from coal, steel, and railroads, European aristocracy was always that grail they lacked. If you can't be born a duke, you must buy a duke. Or, at least, buy his time and presence at your dinner table. Anne Woodward's story is a belated echo of the dollar princesses era, when daughters of American millionaires, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, crossed the ocean to exchange their daddy's millions for the title of an English duchess. But by the mid-20th century, the rules of the game had changed. After 2 world wars, Europe lay in ruins, and its aristocracy impoverished. Counts and princes turned into honorary beggars. They traded their only asset, title and manners. And 1950s New York became a gigantic sales market for them. Anne Woodward, with her sharp predator's instinct, perfectly understood this mechanism. She knew that in the eyes of New York's old money, she would always be a plebeian. But if a member of the royal family sat next to her, on her sofa, even the haughtiest mother-in-law wouldn't dare open her mouth. Anne began collecting titled friends, just as her husband collected racehorses. It was a cynical, purely business deal. The Woodwards provided unlimited budgets, luxurious villas and yachts, while the European guests provided their shining aura. The pinnacle of this collection, the diamond in the crown of Anne's ambitions, became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Edward VIII, the former King of Great Britain, and his wife, Wallis Simpson. This couple was the perfect mirror for the Woodwards. Wallis, like Anne, was an American with a dubious past, twice divorced, whom the royal family hated. She too had climbed to the very top thanks to a man. For Anne, Wallis was a deity, proof that a woman without pedigree could bring the world to its knees. But friendship with the Windsors cost dearly, very dearly. The Duke and Duchess were perhaps the most expensive guests in the world. They never paid for themselves. In high society circles, there existed an unspoken price list. If you wanted the Windsors to attend your party, you had to cover their flight, their stay in the best hotel, provide a limousine, and preferably make a small gift in the form of jewelry or a charity check. Anne paid this vanity tax with joy. She turned her relationship with Wallis Simpson into a tool of social protection. When the Duchess visited the Woodwards, the house in Oyster Bay turned into an embassy of a non-existent state. Menus were coordinated for weeks. Wines were selected by consultants from France. Anne knew that Wallis adored gossip and flattery, and she fed her both. However, behind this sparkle hid deep tragedy and emptiness. Anne's own marriage by this point had turned into a fiction, a commercial enterprise. Billy Woodward financed this endless carnival, but he had long ceased to be a participant in the show. He was just a wallet. He looked at his wife, who groveled before senile aristocrats, and felt disgust. These games were alien to him. He wanted simple things: respect, peace, and perhaps love, which he sought in the arms of other women. For Billy, This deal of the century became bondage. He saw how his money went to feeding a retinue that despised him behind his back. The Duke of Windsor could drink his 1811 cognac and then call Billy a boring banker. But Billy couldn't break this circle. Divorce would mean not only division of property, it would mean public admission of defeat. Anne clung to him with a death grip, because without the Woodwards' money, she would become just an aging former dancer. And Wallace Simpson didn't befriend poor dancers. The culmination of this theater of the absurd was the dinner on October 30th, 1955. It was an evening organized specifically for the Duchess of Windsor. It was supposed to be Anne's triumph. The finest porcelain, silver polished for 3 days, florists who created a real garden in the living room. Anne shone. She had achieved everything the girl from Kansas dreamed of. She was hosting the woman for whom a man renounced the British Empire. But by irony of fate, this very evening became the catalyst of the end. While Anne reveled in her social success, Billy was gloomier than a cloud. He understood that all this tinsel was a lie. He saw the true face of his wife, the face of a manager running a business project called Woodward Family. That night, when the guests dispersed, when the Duchess's limousine disappeared behind the gates, the masks were dropped. Only 2 deeply unhappy people remained in the huge, empty house. The deal to buy titles turned out to be a scam. Anne bought herself a place in society, but the price she paid was her husband's soul and her own safety. She thought that a ducal coat of arms on the invitation would protect her from reality, but reality was already at the doorstep, and in its hands was not a crown, but a loaded gun. Titles do not protect from bullets. Aristocratic friends do not testify in your favor when it comes to murder. On the contrary, they turn away first, so that blood doesn't splatter their white gloves. That night, when the lights went out after the reception, Anne Woodward was left alone with the most terrible realization. She had spent millions to surround herself with people who didn't care about her. She built a castle of sand and gold, but the wave was already rolling in. And this wave was created by her own panic. For it was the fear of losing this fake, bought world that made her pick up the weapon. She was not defending her life. She was defending her deal. She was defending her right to be next to the Duchess. And for this right, she was ready to kill. If you want to understand why Anne Woodward pulled the trigger, you need to look at the blueprints of her house. Architecture is not just walls and a roof. It is the script by which people live. And the script of the Woodwards estate in Oyster Bay was written in the genre of Greek tragedy, where the scenery crushes the actors, driving them insane. The house where the catastrophe occurred was called the Playhouse. Playhouse. What evil irony of fate. Initially, this building on the grounds of the Sunken Orchard Estate, Sunken Garden, was not intended for living. It was an entertainment pavilion built in 1927 for the McCann family. Imagine the scale. A country cottage inside which there was a full-size indoor tennis court under a glass roof. When the Woodwards moved there, escaping Elsie's obsessive control, they turned this place into a fortress of solitude. It was a hybrid building. Outside, elegant Georgian style, white brick, perfect proportions. Inside, a labyrinth where human warmth dissolved in gigantic volumes of air. The center of the house was that very tennis court, a huge echoing space where footsteps reverberated like gunshots. The Woodwards converted adjacent rooms into living quarters, but the building's skeleton remained the same. It was a house for receptions, not for family. It was convenient to hold balls for 200 people here, but unbearable to have breakfast for 2. The walls were paneled with oak panels brought from 17th century English castles. The floors were covered with Aubusson carpets, each worth the annual income of an average American family. But all this luxury was cold. The marble in the bathrooms resembled a morgue. The staircases were too wide, the railings too slippery. The house was designed to inspire awe in guests, not to provide comfort to the owners. Special attention should be paid to the bedroom layout. This is the key to understanding the night of the murder. In normal families, spouses' bedrooms are nearby, or it is one room. For the Woodwards, these were two sovereign states separated by a neutral zone. Billy's bedroom and Anne's bedroom were at opposite ends of a long corridor called the Alley of Shadows. The distance between their doors was about 20 feet. This was not just meters. It was an abyss. To come to her husband, Anne had to make a journey through a dark, lifeless zone. And in this house, they were not the only ones living. The house was populated by shadows, servants. An entire army worked at the Woodwards estate. Butler, cook, maids, chauffeur, gardeners. But their presence was ghostly. The house rules dictated complete invisibility. A servant had to appear a second before being needed and disappear immediately after. Estate manager Frank Vergata and his team maintained perfect order in the gardens designed by the famous Annette Hoyt Flanders. 12 French gardens, interconnected, created the illusion of Versailles. But behind this beauty hid grueling labor. In winter, paths had to be cleared of snow before the owner woke up. Silver was polished daily, even if the Woodwards dined at a restaurant. For the servants, life in the playhouse was constant tension. They saw and heard everything. They knew when Anne locked herself in her room and sobbed. They knew how many bottles of gin disappeared from the bar over the weekend. They found broken glasses and lipstick stains on Billy's shirt collars that needed urgent washing. But they remained silent. Silence was part of the contract. Their salary included not only physical labor, but also amputation of the tongue. The absurdity of daily life peaked in the details. Anne demanded that fresh flowers be changed twice a day so that no petal dared to wilt in her presence. Bed linens were starched to cardboard stiffness, as Elsie liked, and Anne, hating her mother-in-law, paradoxically copied her habits to prove that she too was a lady. But the scariest room was the gun corridor. The Woodwards were hunters, not only for titles, but also for game. Deer heads hung on the walls, and in special cabinets with glass doors, an arsenal was stored. Churchill shotguns, rifles, pistols. This weaponry was part of the interior, like vases or paintings. It was always in view, always accessible. Billy taught Anne to shoot, and she proved a capable student. He gave her that very gun, an elegant double-barreled shotgun made to order for her hand. A gift that would become the instrument of his execution. In the evenings, when guests left, the house turned into a resonator. The silence in the playhouse was not calm, but ringing. Every rustle, creak of the floorboard, or wind noise in the chimney seemed a threat. Anne, pumped with pills and alcohol, wandered these halls, and ghosts seemed to appear to her. But she wasn't afraid of the dead. She was afraid that the walls of this house would one day close in and crush her. On the night of October 30th, architecture played its fatal role. If they had lived in an ordinary apartment, if their beds had been next to each other, the tragedy might not have happened. But the long, dark corridor separating Anne's zone from Billy's zone created ideal conditions for an ambush. It was a stage built for murder. Darkness, echo, distance allowing one to take aim. The Woodwards' house was a monument to the power of money over common sense. It was too vast for love, but perfectly suited for hatred. And when Anne stood in the doorway of her bedroom with a gun in her hands, she was not simply defending herself from a mythical burglar. She was shooting at this cursed house, this golden cage that was sucking the life out of her drop by drop. But the bullet did not hit the wall. The bullet found the one who embodied this prison for her. If you look at the Woodwards' family portraits from 1954, they seem flawless. Glossy magazine paper hid the pores on the skin, and black and white printing smoothed out the red veins in the eyes caused by chronic sleep deprivation and gin. But if you come closer, if you breathe the air these people breathed, you could feel the sweetish, nauseating smell of decay. By the mid-1950s, Anne and Billy's marriage was held together not by love or even calculation. It was held by chemical compounds and mutual terror. Behind the gilded facade of their lives hid a medical record that any modern psychiatrist would call a catastrophe. Anne Woodward lived in a chemical straitjacket. Her morning did not start with coffee, but with amphetamines. Mother's little helpers, as they were cynically called at the time. These pills gave her the energy to be sparkling, to squeeze into size 0 dresses, to laugh at the jokes of boring bankers. They revved up her metabolism and her paranoia to maximum speeds. But by evening, the effect of the stimulants wore off, and crash followed. To drown the trembling in her hands and the panic fear of silence, the heavy artillery came into play. Barbiturates, Seconal, the famous Red Devils. Anne swallowed them like vitamins. And all this was generously washed down with alcohol. The Woodwards did not drink for pleasure. They drank professionally, with the grim determination of people who wanted to erase reality. Martini at lunch, cocktails before dinner, wine at the table, and whiskey before bed. It was an endless cycle. Rev up the heart in the morning, break it in the evening. This toxic mixture was destroying Anne's psyche. She was becoming unpredictable. At social soirees, she could be the life of the party, and a minute later throw a tantrum because the waiter served her the wrong fork. Her mood jumped like the cardiogram of a dying man. But the most terrible side effect was suspicion. She thought everyone was whispering behind her back. And the worst thing, she was right. Billy Woodward was also rotting, but differently. Boredom and the realization of the meaninglessness of his own life were destroying him. He was rich, handsome, and completely empty. He despised himself for allowing this vulgar woman to take over his life and punished her with his indifference. Billy found the classic remedy for family problems: other women. Rumors of his infidelities were not just gossip. They were currency, exchanged in the smoking rooms of the El Morocco Club. They said he had a steady mistress. They said he was tired of Anne's hysterics. For Anne, these rumors sounded like a death knell. In 1950s New York, a 40-year-old divorced woman without her own money and with a reputation as a former dancer turned into a social corpse. She wouldn't just be excluded from guest lists, she would be erased from memory. In the fall of 1955, the situation heated to the limit. Billy began openly talking about divorce. He consulted with lawyers. He discussed with his mother how to minimize financial losses in the separation. For Anne, this was a declaration of war. She understood. If he filed for divorce, she would lose everything: house, jewels, status, children. She would return to Kansas, to the dust and poverty from which she had so arduously escaped. This fear was stronger than the fear of death. An atmosphere of Cold War reigned in the house. They hardly spoke. Servants recalled that Billy could pass his wife in the corridor, looking through her as if she were transparent. This ignoring drove Anne to frenzy. She screamed, smashed dishes, begged, threatened. But he remained deaf. He had already crossed her out of his life. Only the paperwork remained. And then, into this cocktail of hatred and fear, an external ingredient was added that became the catalyst of the tragedy. A burglar really appeared in the Oyster Bay area. Paul Wirtz, a petty criminal, began robbing the mansions of the rich. He was real. Newspapers wrote about the night ghost. People installed additional locks and bought guard dogs. For Anne's inflamed brain, poisoned by amphetamines and alcohol, the figure of the burglar merged with the figure of her husband. In her mind, the threat existed. Someone wanted to break into her fortress and take everything from her.
During the day, this someone was Billy's lawyers and his mother Elsie. At night, this fear projected onto an invisible bandit outside the window. She began sleeping with a weapon. This was not a metaphor. The double-barreled shotgun stood by her bed, loaded and ready for battle. Billy only laughed at her fears. He was a fatalist, or simply drank too much to be afraid. His arrogance played a cruel joke on him. He did not understand that he lived in the same cage with a cornered beast. He thought he controlled the situation because he had a checkbook, but he forgot that Anne had a finger on the trigger. The events of the last days before the murder resembled slow-motion footage of a car crash. On October 28th, 2 days before his death, they were at a party. Witnesses recalled that Anne looked like a taut string. She drank without getting drunk. Her eyes darted. She laughed too loudly. Billy, on the other hand, was gloomy and sullen. He flirted with some debutante right in front of his wife. This was public humiliation, a slap that Anne could not respond to there in the hall. But she remembered. Rot had eaten through the load-bearing structures of their marriage. Only sawdust remained. Outwardly, the playhouse still stood, shining with white walls. But inside, all moral barriers had already collapsed. Anne Woodward had reached the point where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. She saw enemies in every corner. And the main enemy, the person who held a knife to the throat of her future, was the one sleeping in the next room. On that fateful night, they returned from the dinner in honor of the Duchess of Windsor. It was the peak of Anne's social career, and simultaneously the bottom of their relationship. Billy went to his room, slamming the door in her face. He probably thought the conversation was over, that tomorrow he would call the lawyers and start the process. He did not know that tomorrow would not come for him. Anne was left alone in her bedroom. The pills had already begun to take effect. Alcohol roared in her head. Fear pulsed in her temples. She heard a noise. Was it the wind? Was it a cat? Or was it that very burglar? Or perhaps the ghost of her ruined life come to collect the debt? In her hand was the cold wood of the stock. She stepped into the alley of shadows. Rot had eaten a hole in her soul, into which lead would now rush. October 30th, 1955. The clock showed around 2 a.m. In the Playhouse estate, time stopped. All social masks, all intrigues, all future plans compressed into 1 second and one movement of the index finger. In the dark corridor separating the spouses' bedrooms stood Anne Woodward. In her hands, she clutched a 12-gauge double-barreled hunting shotgun. This was not a lady's pistol with a mother-of-pearl grip. This was a weapon designed to stop a running deer or boar. Heavy, cold, lethal. Anne was on the verge of hysteria. The cocktail of alcohol and seconal in her blood turned the shadows in the corridor into monsters. She heard a sound.
A floorboard creak? Rustle of clothing? Or just the pounding of her own heart in her ears? In her mind, this sound transformed into the steps of a killer. That very night ghost the newspapers wrote about. She was convinced that a burglar had broken into the house to kill her. At the other end of the corridor, a door opened. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It was Billy. He had come out of his room. Perhaps he heard the noise. Perhaps he wanted water. Or maybe he finally decided to talk to his wife. We will never know. He stood in the darkness, unaware that he was looking down the barrel of his own double-barreled shotgun. He did not utter a word. Or perhaps he simply did not have time. Anne pulled the trigger. In the confined space of the corridor, the shot sounded like a bomb explosion. The roar assaulted the eardrums. The flash blinded the eyes. The buckshot flew from the barrel at a speed exceeding the speed of sound. The distance was negligible, just a few meters. Billy had no chance. The load of buckshot struck him straight in the face. This was not a neat little hole, as shown in movies. This was monstrous destruction. The physics of a 12-gauge shot at such range is merciless. Billy Woodward, heir to the banking empire, handsome man and millionaire, was killed instantly. His body was thrown backward into the bedroom, onto that very carpet that cost a fortune. For a second, a ringing silence hung. Then hell began. The smell of burned gunpowder mixed with the smell of blood and expensive Chanel perfume. Anne stood in a cloud of smoke, deafened, with the smoking shotgun in her hands. When her vision returned and she realized what she had done, a scream tore from her chest that could wake even the dead.
I shot Billy! I shot my Billy!
She screamed, throwing down the shotgun and falling to her knees. She crawled to her husband's body, staining her silk peignoir with blood. She tried to embrace what remained of his head, sobbing and repeating his name. The servants rushed in at the noise. The butler saw a scene that haunted him until the end of his days. The lady of the house, mad with grief and horror, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and the master dead. They called the police. They called the doctor. But there was nothing for the doctor to do here. A coroner was needed here. Nassau County Police arrived quickly. Sirens sliced through the night silence of Oyster Bay, heralding the end of an era. When the detectives entered the house, they saw a surreal sight. A luxurious mansion full of antiques, and in the midst of this splendor, a bloodbath. Anne was in a state of shock. She was shaking, unable to speak coherently. I thought it was a burglar. I thought it was a burglar, she repeated like a mantra. And then Elsie Woodward took the stage. The clan matriarch learned of what happened, one of the first. One can only imagine what this woman felt upon learning that her beloved son was killed, and killed by that very girl she hated so much. But Elsie was made of steel. Even in the moment of greatest grief, her brain worked like a computer. She understood. Billy could not be brought back, but the Woodward name could still be saved. If Anne went to trial for premeditated murder, all the dirty laundry would come out. Affairs, alcoholism, pills, financial problems, hatred. The newspapers would tear the family apart. The bank's reputation, the family's reputation, would be destroyed. Elsie made the decision instantly. She, the woman who had lost her son, became the chief defender of his killer. She arrived at the scene, or contacted the police. History diverges on the details of her physical presence in the first minutes, but her influence was palpable. The version of the accident had to become the only one. My poor daughter-in-law, she was so afraid of burglars. This is a tragic mistake, These words, spoken by Elsie, became law for the police and the press. But the world beyond the estate exploded. In the morning, headlines in all American newspapers screamed, "Society shocked. Mrs. Woodward shoots husband, mistaking him for thief." It was a sensation on the level of the Titanic's sinking. New York's most beautiful couple, and such an end. Life magazine called it the shot of the century. People in subways, housewives in kitchens, brokers on the exchange, everyone discussed only one thing. Did she really mistake him for a burglar? Or was it an execution? Gossips recalled everything. Quarrels at parties, divorce rumors, Anne's ambitions. "She killed him because he wanted to leave," they whispered in Park Avenue drawing rooms. "She knew what she was doing. She's a hunter. She knows how to shoot." The nickname Bang Bang stuck to Anne instantly and forever. In those first hours after the murder, Anne Woodward crossed the point of no return. She survived. Legally, she was almost safe thanks to her mother-in-law's intercession. But morally, she was destroyed. She had killed the man she once loved, and the man who was her only ticket to high society. Looking at Billy's body as the orderlies carried it away, she understood that along with him, in that black bag, her life was also leaving. Fate's irony dealt the final blow. A few days later, the police really caught that very burglar, Paul Wirtz. He confessed that on that night he was on the estate grounds and even tried to break into the house. His confession saved Anne from prison. The alibi was ironclad. The burglar existed. The fear was justified. But this legal justification had no power in the court of public opinion. For society, she became the Black Widow. That night divided the Woodwards' history into before and after. The brilliant facade collapsed, exposing blood-stained bricks. The golden boy was dead, and Cinderella stood over his body with a smoking shotgun, transformed into an evil witch. The tragedy had occurred, but the worst punishment for Anne was still ahead. She had to live with it, live in a vacuum of contempt, awaiting the second shot, this time literary, which Truman Capote would fire 20 years later. After the shot, silence fell. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a calculator tallying losses. Great empires rarely collapse from one blow. They disintegrate slowly, brick by brick, eaten away by taxes, inflation, and lack of will to live. Billy Woodward's death launched a liquidation mechanism that could no longer be stopped. Immediately after the funeral, at which Anne Woodward stood in a thick black veil like a heroine of Greek tragedy, the mathematics of the curse began. The first thing was to pay inheritance taxes. In the 1950s, in the United States, they were draconian. The state took the lion's share of capital upon change of ownership. To preserve the bank and real estate, the crown had to be sold. The symbol of this collapse became the sale of the legendary stallion Nashua. The horse that was Billy's pride, the living embodiment of the family's success, went under the hammer. This was not just an auction, it was a fire sale of a dream. A buyer's syndicate paid $1,251,200 for him. At that time, it was the highest price ever paid for a horse in human history. Newspapers wrote about it with enthusiasm, but for the family, it was humiliation. They were selling a family member to pay the bills for his murder. Elsie Woodward, the Iron Lady of the clan, took control into her own hands. She gave Anne an allowance sufficient for a comfortable life, but insufficient for independence. This was a leash, short and tight. The condition was simple: Anne had to disappear from the radars. The grand jury found her not guilty of murder, attributing everything to an accident. But high society issued its verdict: guilty. The doors of Fifth Avenue mansions slammed shut in her face forever. Those very people who drank her champagne and ate her caviar a week ago now crossed to the other side of the street upon seeing her. Anne became a social leper. She had to leave the playhouse. The house that she had so diligently turned into the scenery of her triumph stood empty. Furniture was covered with white sheets, like shrouds. Later, the estate was sold, divided into plots, and lost its grandeur. The era of giant palaces was passing into the past. Anne moved to an apartment in New York, luxurious, huge, with a view of Central Park, but still an apartment. This was a demotion in status. From landowner, she turned into just a rich widow. She tried to escape the ghosts in Europe, Paris, Rome, Gstaad. There, among old aristocrats and new playboys, she tried to buy herself a new life. But the fame of Mrs. Bang Bang flew ahead of her faster than an airplane. Behind her back, they whispered. Waiters smirked. She was a sight, viewed with horror and curiosity, like a predator in a zoo. But the main victims of this fall were the children, James and William Woodward III, boys who slept in the same house that fateful night. They lost their father, and their mother became an outcast. Elsie Woodward, believing that Anne had a bad influence on her grandsons, insisted on sending them to closed boarding schools. The boys were torn from home and thrown into the cold world of elite education, where the cruelty of classmates knew no bounds. In the school corridors of Groton or La Rosie, they were not allowed to forget who their mother was. "Your mom killed your dad." They heard this phrase constantly. They grew up in isolation, surrounded by money but deprived of love. The trauma received in childhood began to eat away at their souls, just as it had eaten away at their parents' souls. James sought salvation in religion, then in drugs, then in psychiatric clinics. William tried to emulate his father, but the shadow of the tragedy was too long. The Woodward legacy turned into a toxic asset for them. The 1960s were underway. The world was changing. The Beatles, the sexual revolution, the Vietnam War. New York's old money was losing its monopoly on power. New millionaires were emerging who didn't give a damn about the Knickerbockers and their rules. In this new chaos, Anne Woodward felt a bit freer. She began going out in society again, hoping that time had erased memories. And it was precisely at this moment, when she was most vulnerable and alone, that Truman Capote entered her life. A small, eccentric writer with the voice of a spoiled child. He did not turn away from her. On the contrary, he sought her company. He became her girlfriend. He listened to her confessions, nodded, poured wine, and remembered every word. Anne saw in him a kindred spirit. He too was an outsider, a gay man from a southern state who had broken into the elite through talent and audacity. She thought he understood her pain as an upstart. She trusted him. She told him about that night, about the fears, the hatred for her mother-in-law, the emptiness. She did not know that for Capote, she was not a friend, but material. He was a vulture waiting for the victim to weaken completely. By the mid-1970s, the Woodwards' financial might no longer seemed boundless. The inflation of the 1970s was devouring capital. Maintaining real estate and their lifestyle required colossal expenses. Anne continued spending, trying to fill the void with things.
but it brought no joy.
She was a relic of a bygone era, a living fossil. She sat in her apartment on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by portraits of her dead husband and antique vases, and waited. For what? Forgiveness? Oblivion? She did not know she was waiting for the executioner. Capote was preparing to publish his magnum opus, the novel Answered Prayers. He promised it would be the greatest book of the century, a modern Proust. But in reality, it was a collection of gossip he peddled to stay afloat. The Great Fall was coming to an end. The Woodward Empire, built on the granite of the bank, had turned to ashes. Assets sold off, heirs broken, reputation destroyed. Only the final act remained, the physical elimination of the main heroine. And this act would be carried out not by a court, not by illness, but by a Smith Corona typewriter on which Truman Capote hammered out the death sentence for his girlfriend. Anne Woodward thought the worst was already behind her, that the shot of 1955 was the climax. She was wrong. The real reckoning came 20 years later in the form of magazine galleys. The price of wealth turned out to equal the price of life, and when the mailman brought her that very issue of Esquire, the circle closed. October 10, 1975. Anne Woodward lies dead next to the Esquire magazine. She thought that suicide would stop the pain and return control to her, but she merely pulled the trigger a second time, finishing off not herself, but her family. The curse that she unleashed 20 years ago entered its second round. Her sons, William III and James, never recovered from their mother's shadow. In 1978, just 3 years after Anne's death, James, tormented by depression and drugs, jumped out of the window of the 9th floor of his New York apartment. He left a note. "I am finally free." He was free from the name, from money, from memory. William III lived longer, but not happier. He tried to be a businessman, writer, philanthropist. But wherever he went, a bloody trail followed him. In 1999, at the age of 54, he too stepped into the void, from the 13th floor of his Manhattan home. The male line of the Woodwards ended. Billions of dollars, earned by the sweat and steel of great-grandfathers, could not save from gravity and despair. What remains of this empire today? Practically nothing. The bank that William Woodward Sr. built has long dissolved in a series of mergers and acquisitions. The Sunken Orchard estate is divided and built up. The Playhouse was demolished. From the architecture of power and solitude, not even the foundation remains. But there is one place where the Woodward name lives on. This is the racetrack. The Woodward Stakes race is still one of the most prestigious events in the world of horse racing. This is the only legacy that survived the family tragedy. And there is bitter irony in this. The great banker invested his soul not in people, but in horses. And only the horses preserved his name. And what about the modern anchor? Where do we see the echo of this story today? In every new season of Ryan Murphy's series, in every article about cursed families, from Kennedy to Getty, we see it in Anderson Cooper's eyes when he talks about his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, one of Capote's swans who survived, unlike Anne. Anne Woodward's story teaches us one thing: wealth and legacy are not the same. Wealth is what you can buy. Legacy is what you leave behind in people's hearts. The Woodwards bought everything: houses, titles, horses, the silence of the police.
but they could not buy love or peace. And here is the final paradox. At the very beginning, we talked about the magazine that killed a woman. But the killer was not the paper nor the ink. The killer was the story itself, which she so desperately tried to rewrite. She wanted to be a princess, but became a monster. She wanted to enter history, and she did enter it.
But not as the hostess of a salon, but as a woman who committed the perfect crime and still paid for it in full.